The creature looked wrong. It seemed almost to have two snouts, one on top of the other. The deformity looked like a video game rendering error of the sort that makes a virtual plant disappear into a wall and come out the other side. Like one snout had incorrectly rendered inside the other, and a tiny bit of the duplicate, just the nose, was poking through the coyote's face. I stared into the creature's wide, dark eyes for what felt like hours. Its noses twitched, both of them, as it sniffed the air. "Easy, boy," I muttered the words to the creature in what I hoped to be a slow, calming whisper. "Take it easy." The beast stared. I didn't move a muscle. Then, the coyote cocked its odd head to the side, and quickly, so quickly that I still questioned whether it had happened at all, the coyote winked. Behind me, a branch snapped and I spun. Finding nothing, I turned quickly back to the creature, but it was gone, scared away, no doubt, by the noise. I was breathing heavily, far more heavily than my brief hike up the trail merited. It took a moment to collect myself. I'd seen deformed animals before, goats with extra legs, deer with stubby little antlers. This coyote was just an accident of birth, the product of a twisted genome. Surely it hadn't actually winked at me, and even if it had, it was an animal, so it couldn't have been communicating anything with a minor twitch. I carried on up the trail, but the image of the coyote and its bizarre double snout stayed with me. Around mile 1.5, I reached another clearing. On the left-hand side of the path, this rest stop featured a bench carved from one of the sharp little trees. I paused briefly to tighten the laces on my boots and take a sip from my Nalgene. As I screwed the cap back on, movement from the corner of my eye caught my attention. I spun, half expecting to find the coyote staring back at me. Instead, I found another hiker passing me on the trail. He was descending, heading the opposite direction from me. The man wore brown hiking boots that rose to mid-calf. Gray socks extended from underneath, just a bit farther up his calves, ending below olive green work shoes the same color as my own. Unlike mine, however, his shorts lacked the little loop from which someone using them for manual labor might hang a hammer. They also lacked the little yellow C that marked the brand on the back right pocket. His blue baseball cap was pulled low enough that I didn't get a good look at his face, but I noticed that his gray t-shirt seemed entirely free of sweat. The man raised a hand as I turned, though didn't say anything. "How's that last stretch?" I asked as he passed to my right. "Easy." He rumbled the word in a deep baritone, not much louder than a whisper, drawing it out into a languid assurance. He continued down the trail. "How's the view?" I asked to his back. "Easy," I heard again in the same slow whisper before the hiker disappeared around the next switchback. I shook my head, not sure I'd heard the guy correctly, as I gathered my belongings and finished lacing my boots. The sun was beginning to sink. I reached the trail's peak a little less than a mile later and was greeted by a sweeping view of the surrounding desert. By then, a brilliant sunset painted the desert, and I marveled at the view for nearly 20 minutes. As I made my way back down the trail, the temperature dropped with the sun. A cloudy evening obscured the views I'd enjoyed on the way up, and by the time I'd reached halfway down the trail, I had to use the flashlight on my phone to light the path in front of me. Hiking at night is always unnerving. This wasn't the first time I'd been caught out on a trail after sundown, and the desert path was much less intimidating than some of the more heavily wooded trails in the other parks I visited. Still, the normal sounds of wildlife become much more sinister at night. As I descended, my thoughts turned back to the events of the day. I'd woken up at the crack of dawn to make the long drive. I didn't mind road trips, but the space between Austin and Big Bend was just empty. Not like one little town every couple of miles empty. Completely empty. Bring a spare can of gas and make sure you fill up every time you see a station empty. I'd really plumbed the depths of the podcast universe, and even my favorite programs had run stale by the time I'd reached the welcome sign. What was it the ranger had said to me? Don't talk to the animals? I suppose a person has to be a bit odd to become a park ranger anyway, especially one way out here in the middle of nowhere. Still, strange thing to say. The memory of the odd warning brought to mind the coyote with its warped system error snout. I shuddered at the image. A branch snapped to my left. Wind whistled through the bushes. I sped up. A rock had found its way into one of my boots, and I bent to fish it out. The wind was whistling again. I held my phone in my mouth as I pulled one of my socks higher to make the boot a bit more accessible. The laces had loosened over the course of the day, and I could fit a finger down to the sole. I found the pebble and worked it out of my shoe with my index finger. I rolled it just past the top lace, near the middle of my calf. It was difficult to see the little gray stone. It matched the color of my socks nearly exactly, and the low light didn't help. I managed to grab it before it could fall back into my boots, though, and tossed it into the brush along the side of the path. It made a small click as it landed. I stood and continued. I didn't get more than a few steps before I felt a tiny impact on the side of my leg. Assuming I'd kicked up a stick as I'd been walking, I carried on. After another few steps, though, I felt another pebble in my boot. This one hadn't gotten deep, and I didn't need my light to fish it out. I held it between my index finger and thumb. This one, too, matched my socks. I tossed it as I had the other and carried on. A few steps later, I felt another impact, this time at my ear. A bug, surely. I paused briefly before speeding up. Crickets buzzed loudly, and their nighttime whine seemed to come from every direction at once. A branch snapped. I was nearly jogging by the time I heard it. Easy. Slow, deep, quiet, so quiet I couldn't be sure I'd heard it at all. I broke into a run. All around me, the trail seemed to come alive. Branches snapped, and the wind rustled, and crickets whined so loudly it was nearly deafening. My phone's light bounced as I ran, and my backpack jostled uncomfortably on my back. A root caught my foot. I threw my hands out to break my fall. The trail's tiny, sharp rocks dug painfully into my knees and my palms as I hit the ground. I scrambled to stand, but as I looked up, I found myself eye level with a pair of brown hiking boots. Easy. On my hands and knees in the dust of the trail, bleeding into the grit, I froze. Strong hands hoisted me from the ground, and I could do nothing but allow myself to be lifted. After an eternity, I raised my eyes and found myself face to face with the park ranger. Easy, she said, in the same careful tone that she'd used when selling my admission ticket, not the hiker's creepy whisper. I caught my breath for a moment before I responded, "Thanks." I dusted off my shorts and stepped back. Once I collected myself, I realized that I'd reached the end of the path and the ranger stood at the trailhead. My car was just a few feet away, and a light over the parking lot illuminated us. The ranger was holding a shotgun. She wasn't pointing it at me precisely, but she certainly wasn't pointing it anywhere else either. If she fired it, she'd probably blow off a few of my toes. Behind her stood the old couple I'd seen on the way up the path. The old man stood straighter now than he had earlier in the afternoon, and he traded his walking sticks for a shotgun of his own. His wife, too, was armed, and the three of them stood unmoving between me and my aging forerunner. None of them looked directly at me. In fact, each seemed to be looking pointedly at a spot where I wasn't. "What did I tell you when you first came into the park this afternoon, friend?" The ranger asked the question carefully and without much inflection. She still didn't meet my eyes, instead staring at the path behind me. Given her monotone, I couldn't tell whether she was scolding me or testing me. "Don't talk to the..." I paused. "The coyote. Don't talk to the animals," I finished. The ranger and her companions, all visibly deflated, as if they'd been holding their breath. Each of the three of them finally turned their eyes to me, and the ranger shouldered her firearm. "Friend, you get back in that car and you head straight out of this park," the old man commanded me, with a gravity that could not possibly have come from the doddering old fellow I'd met earlier in the day. "Don't stop. Not for nothing," the old woman added. "Or nobody." She fixed me with a steely gaze that matched the gravity of her husband's. "Not until you're out of the park. I wouldn't worry too much about the speed limit either, friend," the ranger added. I opened my mouth to ask what in God's name the three of them were talking about, but the ranger fixed her jaw in such a way as to indicate that the conversation was over. The old couple wore similar expressions, and the three of them turned their full attention to the path, guns aimed to the ground. I followed their instructions. I didn't change my boots. I didn't take off my shirt, even though a day's worth of sweat had turned into gray material nearly the same color black as my car's upholstery. The Forerunner came to life with its deep rumble, and I stomped the gas, peeling out of the parking lot with a squeal. My hands didn't stop shaking until I was nearly 3 miles from the trailhead. The road in and out of Big Bend is straight and covers several miles between the park entrance and the trails. I'd finally begun to relax, and I could see the ranger's booth in the distance when I heard it again. "Easy." The same slow whisper, so quiet that my rumbling engine nearly drowned it out. I spun my head in every direction. The sun was all the way down by this point, and I couldn't see much outside the too dim glow of my headlights. I heard it again. "Easy, boy." The same tone, the same whisper. "Take it easy, boy." Faster this time, but not like a person who talked fast, like a video game played at double speed. I continued to look frantically around me, doing my best to keep some attention on the road. Motion at the corner of my eye caught my attention. I turned my head to the right. At the very edge of the half-circle of road, illuminated in my headlights, ran an animal. An animal that looked like it had 2 snouts, one on top of the other. I stomped the gas. Easy. Loud, deafening, but still soft somehow. like the recording of a whisper played at full volume through an expensive sound system. The ranger's hut grew larger in the distance. I kept my attention on the road in front of me, but from the corner of my eye, I could see that the coyote, the whatever it was still right on the edge of my headlights. I chanced a look at it, only for a moment. The sight still haunts me. On the edge of the road, just outside the light of my headlights, ran the coyote on its hind legs. Its twin snouts foamed and its mouth yawned open. As it panted, the creature's jaw opened wider than any natural being's ought to, and row upon row of human-looking teeth hung nearly to its chest, a chest that seemed to be wearing a gray t-shirt, but not wearing it precisely. Rather, the shirt seemed almost to grow from the creature's body, giving way seamlessly to the patchy fur of its arms and stomach. It turned its head and looked directly at me. Its eyes were no longer the white-brown eyes of an animal, but rather piercing blue eyes, like a human's, like mine. The coyote winked. I tore my gaze from the abomination to spare a glance at my speedometer. I was going 87 miles per hour. I willed the aging SUV to go faster, faster than it had any right to go, faster than whatever was keeping pace with me out my window. I stole another glance at the creature. As I turned my head, I saw the beast stop. Not slow down, stop. Completely. As if it had run into a wall. I whizzed past the ranger's hut and then the welcome sign, and didn't ease up on the gas until both were firmly in my rear view. But I heard it again. Take it easy. I slammed on the brakes, and I could smell the rubber burning under my tires. Don't let the sound of your own wheels make you crazy. The eagles crooned from my car speakers. I had service again. The song had carried on right where it had left off as my phone picked up a signal. I put the old SUV in park right there in the middle of the road. Tears ran freely down my cheeks and my hand shook so violently I couldn't have driven the car if I tried. I don't know how long I sat there, parked in the middle of the West Texas highway. Minutes, half an hour, hours. Once I'd pulled myself together, I called the Marfa Hotel where I'd intended to spend the night and canceled my reservation. I drove straight home, through the night and into the morning. I stopped only for gas and hardly took a breath until I reached my Austin apartment. I double-locked the door, pulled the blinds closed, and collapsed, exhausted, into my bed. I'm still not sure just what the hell I saw out there in the desert, but the next morning, I had the thought, for the first time, but certainly not for the last, that maybe the national parks aren't just there to preserve natural beauty. Shenandoah. And how long will you be staying at the Skyland Lodge? I winced at the hotel's unfortunate name. The members of a Depression-era Public Works Committee had no doubt deliberated for months on just what to call Shenandoah's in-park accommodation, but their efforts had not paid off. Just the one night. I handed the desk attendant my credit card. Well, we're glad you can join us. She passed a map over the counter, along with 2 keys and my receipt. You're in room 188 in the Hazeltop building. Just follow this road to the right. I thanked the woman, crossed the small lobby, and pushed open the door into a crisp autumn afternoon. My decrepit forerunner waited in the lot outside. I dropped the room keys and their associated paperwork into my backpack on the front passenger seat and started the old beast. The SUV rumbled reluctantly to life, and its engine spluttered at the indignity of being called again to service so shortly after I'd last shut it off. I patted the dashboard affectionately. "You're doing great, girl." As if on cue, the engine quieted at my affection. Rather than head directly to my no doubt dingy room, I took a left out of the visitor center parking lot. I noted on the map that a portion of the Appalachian Trail crossed through the park just down the road. The trail was on my bucket list. I certainly couldn't hike the whole thing today, but I always enjoyed walking a few miles when I visited the parks I passed through. After only a moment on the road, I came to the Stony Man Trail parking lot. The area provided little more than a dusty shoulder off the main road, so I found a hospitable section of dirt to park the 4Runner. I opted to leave my backpack and boots in their place on the passenger seat, but decided to take my hat. As I unsnapped it from its place on my backpack strap, I remembered the cooler just below the seat. A lifetime ago, a college girlfriend had painted its top to mimic a brown wicker weave. "A picnic basket for your next hike," she teased. A gift from a beach trip we'd taken with friends, the cooler lasted far longer than the relationship, and I'd filled it with sandwiches before departing from my Washington apartment. I lifted its lid, digging past a cold pack to fetch a foil-wrapped turkey and Swiss. I stuffed my lunch into my back pocket and left several sandwiches and a sports drink for my return. The Stony Man Trail climbs gently uphill through 1.5 miles of dense woods. About halfway through the hike, the white blazes of the Appalachian Trail give way to blue swatches that mark a path to the summit. Autumn had decorated the Shenandoah foliage in brilliant orange, red, and green, and I found myself so caught up in this natural fireworks display that I nearly missed the turn. I managed to tear my attention from the trees for long enough to find my way, though, and after about half an hour of hiking, I reached the summit. Below me, the Shenandoah Valley stretched in every direction. Farmland checkered the countryside, creating a haphazard patchwork of wheat-brown, rolling green hills, and brilliant autumn color. Little white farmhouses dotted the landscape, and I imagined their occupants concluding a hard day's work in front of roaring fire. I sat there, daydreaming, for some time. The drive had worn me out, though, and I looked forward to dinner, a good night's sleep, and a morning of hiking the next day. The blue blazes guided me back to the white swatches, and at a leisurely stroll I made my way back down, accompanied by the lyrical